Green electricity for everyone, everywhere. Is it possible? Let's take a look. The big picture is preserving the Earth's biodiversity for the future. The idea is bigger is better, building massive offshore islands for wind and solar, transporting gigawatts of electricity via undersea cables to interconnect countries and continents. And yet, people put solar panels on their homes, small wind turbines in their gardens, and micro water wheels in their streams. Why do they do that? When you boil some water for a cup of tea, does it matter whether the electricity comes halfway around the world or from the solar panel on the roof? Generating electricity at home is helping the environment. Less transmission infrastructure, substations and converters, and less alteration to the natural habitat. More infrastructure means higher electricity costs. Renewable energy from wind and solar is intermittent and varies all of the time, so will not match the grid demand. There needs to be a way of storing the excess renewable energy and retrieving it later. Otherwise, a base load power supply is required that can be switched on and off anytime. Battery storage allows intermittent renewable energy to be stored for later use. In the summer, the battery and EV are filled with solar and wind energy, and the generation is then curtailed. In the winter, there is less solar energy available, and the battery and EV are only partly filled. In order to supply all of the home and EV demands, a natural gas factory is brought online. Most of the solar production is in the summer, whereas most of the consumption is in the winter. In a hard winter, or whenever there are several days without sunshine and wind, the battery remains empty, and natural gas meets all of the peak home and EV demands. An electrolyzer makes green hydrogen from green electricity and water. The hydrogen gas is compressed and stored in tanks. A fuel cell uses the stored hydrogen to generate electricity. In the summer, the home and EV demands are either met directly with the solar and wind generation or with electricity generated from the stored hydrogen. The hydrogen is produced whenever there is spare capacity throughout the year. In a hard winter period, when there is no solar or wind available, the home and EV use the electricity generated from the stored hydrogen. Typically, due to costs, battery storage is short-term and hydrogen storage is long-term. Battery storage needs a firm backup, usually natural gas, for when the battery is empty. Hydrogen is baseload. Let's use California as the example for utility generation. Here's some data for the state, both for home electricity and EV use. The state electricity grid mix for a Californian home with average electricity consumption. The daily home demand has a peak in the late afternoon and evening when people return home from work and switch on lots of appliances. Daily demand is partially met with the baseload sources of nuclear, hydro, biomass and geothermal, with wind and solar generation added on top. In order to better use the solar, the energy is stored into a battery and consumed later during the home peak demand. Natural gas is used whenever the battery is empty and there is not enough wind and solar. The solar generation can also be used directly in the morning, early afternoon, off-peak period. Evening and overnight EV home charging uses natural gas, as the battery is already empty from servicing the home peak. What's the best way to use lots of solar energy that is not generated at the peak demands of the day? For reference, wind energy has a better demand match throughout the day. EV charging in the morning or early afternoon uses green electricity. Evening and night EV charging uses natural gas, so increases the carbon dioxide emissions. Clearly, the emissions changed during the day. Solar in the morning and early afternoon, and natural gas at other times. The carbon intensity changes throughout the day. The time of use tariff will incentivize the Californians to use public chargers during the day. Both solar and wind generation are low cost, modular and scalable into farms. The battery stores the solar and wind energy, typically once per day, and discharges the energy during the home peak demand. Natural gas is the backup baseload supply. The battery is the most expensive part of the system. The future will see more solar and wind generation and a bigger battery to store the extra energy. The increased electricity demand for more EVs and conversion for home electrical appliances will need more natural gas backup. Hydrogen production uses electricity, and the cost of the electricity largely determines the cost of the hydrogen. 1 kilogram of green hydrogen is expensive to manufacture. Short-term hydrogen storage is more expensive than a battery. However, long-term hydrogen storage is cheaper. Additionally, hydrogen doesn't need a fleet of natural gas factories in reserve. As future solar and wind generation increases, so does hydrogen storage. The most efficient EV and petrol cars are used here for comparison. The cost per gallon equivalent for electric is higher than petrol. But the cost per mile for an EV can be less than a petrol car when home charging. Using EV public charging is expensive. The state electricity grid mix for California, Oklahoma, and Missouri. California is mostly natural gas and solar. Oklahoma, natural gas and wind. Missouri, mostly coal. The emissions for the petrol hybrid. The emissions for the EV in the 3 states. Missouri produces more emissions due to the heavy coal use. The running cost and emissions of an EV or petrol car depend on where you live. Cheap renewable energy generation and expensive electricity bills. Your choices are: switch to everything electric, continue to use a fossil car and fossil appliances, or move to another state. Perhaps you are 100% electric, but your neighbour isn't. Or most of your state is electric, but the next state isn't. Or most of your country is electric, but the next closest country isn't. So there's always going to be a mixture of green and dirty, because not everyone can pay for expensive electricity. Next time, we'll look at some solutions and find one that gives everyone an equitable quality of life.